The Queen and neighborhood in Seattle, Washington, is known for its breathtaking views and historic homes. But one property has drawn more than just curious fans. The former residence of Nirvana's iconic frontman, Kurt Cobain, has become the epicenter of eerie tales since his tragic death in 1994. Neighbors first noticed something amiss just weeks after Cobain's passing. Residents claimed to hear faint strains of an unplugged guitar drifting through the crisp Seattle air late at night. The music, hauntingly beautiful and unmistakably grunge, seemed to echo from the property even when it was vacant. Then came the lights. On multiple occasions, passers-by reported seeing flickering blue and white glows in the upper windows of the house. These lights would pulse rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and then abruptly vanish. Electricians and property managers investigated, but no faulty wiring or rational explanation was ever found. Several delivery drivers and late-night joggers shared chilling encounters near the property. A local Uber driver recounted seeing a shadowy figure standing at the end of the driveway, wearing what appeared to be a flannel shirt and jeans eerily reminiscent of Cobain's signature style. The figure reportedly disappeared into thin air as the driver approached. One of the most unsettling stories came from a musician who visited the house in 2010. While taking photos near the property, he heard what he described as a faint voice humming. When he played back his phone's recording later, he claimed to hear the words, "I just want to say goodbye," whispered faintly in the background. The small room where Kurt reportedly spent hours writing music has become a hotspot for paranormal investigators. Some who've entered described a suffocating energy, while others claimed to feel an overwhelming sadness. Devices used to detect electromagnetic fields reportedly spike uncontrollably in the room, even when all electronics are powered off. A former caretaker who lived in the house briefly during renovations in the late 1990s left after just 2 months, citing an unshakable feeling of being watched. "It's like someone's there, just out of sight, and they don't want you to be comfortable," she explained. Cobain's fans, of course, have their own theories. Some believe his spirit lingers due to unresolved emotions tied to his untimely death. Others think the energy left behind is a residual haunting, imprints of the musician's turbulent life. The property, now owned by a private individual, remains one of Seattle's most talked about spots. While some dismiss the stories as urban legend or overactive imaginations, others insist there's something undeniably strange about the house. For those brave enough to visit, the haunting melodies and flickering lights serve as a reminder of the artistic genius who once called it home and perhaps never truly left. In the summer of 2015, a local journalist, intrigued by the persistent stories, decided to investigate. She managed to secure an interview with a former neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived next door since the early 1980s. The neighbor, hesitant at first, eventually relented. "I don't like to talk about it," she said, lowering her voice. "But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear him." The journalist leaned in closer. "Hear who?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the house. "Kurt, or something that sounds like him. It's not just the music. Sometimes I hear laughter, but it's wrong, like it's coming from a faraway place." The journalist pressed for details, but the woman abruptly ended the interview, refusing to say more. A week later, determined to uncover the truth, the journalist contacted a local paranormal group. Armed with cameras, thermal sensors, and audio recorders, the team secured permission from the current owner to investigate. That night, the team set up in Cobain's former music room, now a sparsely furnished space with peeling paint and faded hardwood floors. Hours passed with little activity until midnight. The lead investigator's thermal camera picked up a cold spot near the corner of the room. It moved, almost as if pacing. The cold spot seemed to hover near the doorway before suddenly vanishing. Moments later, the audio recorder captured a faint, static-filled whisper. "It wasn't supposed to be this way." As the team packed up for the night, one member reported feeling a sharp tug on her backpack strap. Turning around, she found no one there, but the strap had snapped clean in two. The journalist, still skeptical despite the findings, decided to dig deeper into the house's history. She managed to obtain access to a box of items left behind after Cobain's death: old journals, scraps of lyrics, and a dusty cassette tape labeled simply home recordings. Last session, curious, she borrowed an old cassette player to listen. The tape started with a familiar riff, something reminiscent of Nevermind but raw, unfinished. Then came a voice, unmistakably Cobain's, muttering softly. But the muttering wasn't random. It was directed. "You'll see it," the voice said. "They'll all see it. But not yet." At that moment, the journalist's cassette player malfunctioned, ejecting the tape with a sharp metallic screech. She inspected it and found that the tape had partially unspooled itself, forming a tangled mess. When she tried to play it again, the audio was gone. All that remained was static. Days later, the journalist began hearing things in her own apartment. Faint laughter, the same wrong laughter the elderly neighbor had described, seemed to echo in the stillness of her home. One night, she woke to find her living room lights flickering. On her coffee table was a single handwritten note. "Leave it alone. You don't want to know." The handwriting bore an eerie resemblance to Cobain's, matching signatures she had seen in his journals. Determined not to be scared off, the journalist sent the damaged cassette to an audio restoration expert. Weeks later, the expert returned with a digital version of the tape, though he looked visibly uneasy. "There's something odd about this recording," he said. "When I cleaned up the static, I found layers. It's like there's another voice underneath Kurt's. I couldn't isolate it completely, but you'll hear it." The journalist pressed play. As Cobain's voice faded in and out, there was indeed another voice, deep, distorted, and whispering. At first, it was unintelligible, but then a phrase emerged, clear and chilling. "He didn't choose this, but you will." The journalist froze, rewinding and replaying the segment, but the phrase was gone, replaced by more static. Later that night, as she reviewed her notes in her dimly lit apartment, the journalist's phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but she answered. First, all she heard was static. Then, a faint voice crackled through the line, humming a tune that made her skin crawl. It was something in the way, but slower, drawn out, and almost unrecognizable. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The humming stopped, replaced by a low chuckle. "You should have left it alone." The call disconnected. Panicked, she checked the call log. There was no record of the number. The next morning, the journalist received an unmarked package at her office. Inside was a single, rusty key accompanied by a note. "The basement. Everything you're looking for is there." She recognized the key immediately. It matched photos of the original locks on Cobain's house, ones that had been replaced years ago. But the house's basement was rumored to be sealed off, its entrance covered during renovations. Ignoring her growing unease, she contacted the current owner of the property, who reluctantly agreed to let her investigate further. When she arrived at the house, a contractor was already at work, chiseling away the plaster covering the old basement door. Behind it was a set of stairs leading into darkness, the air thick and stale. As she descended, her flashlight illuminated the cluttered space. Old boxes, forgotten instruments, and scraps of paper were strewn across the floor. But in the far corner, something caught her eye: a small, makeshift shrine. Candles, long extinguished, surrounded a framed photograph of Cobain. Beneath the photo was a notebook, its pages covered in erratic handwriting. Flipping through, she found lyrics that seemed incomplete, fragmented thoughts trailing off into nonsense. Then, at the very back of the notebook was a single line written over and over again. "Not alone. Never alone." The words were crossed out violently, as if in anger. As she turned to leave, her flashlight flickered, plunging the basement into pitch blackness. From the shadows came the unmistakable sound of a guitar string snapping, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. She froze, heart pounding, as a voice whispered from the darkness. "You've come too far." The footsteps stopped just feet away, but the journalist couldn't see anything in the suffocating dark. Her flashlight buzzed faintly before sputtering back to life. The beam caught a glimpse of something, a shadow against the far wall, taller and broader than any person. But it wasn't just a shadow. It moved, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, as if struggling to hold a shape. The air grew colder, and the voice came again, closer this time, deep and guttural. "You should have stayed upstairs." The journalist stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her grip. Her foot caught on a loose board, and she fell hard onto the concrete floor. The notebook she had been clutching skittered out of her hands, landing open on a page she hadn't seen before. Written in bold, jagged letters were the words, "I told you they'd come back." As she read the line, the lights in the house flickered violently. From the corner of the room came a sound she could only describe as laughter, but it wasn't human. It was distorted, echoing, as if coming from several voices at once. Scrambling to her feet, she aimed her flashlight at the walls. What she saw made her breath catch. Scrawled across the exposed brick, in what looked like ash or soot, were dozens of phrases repeating over and over. "Help me. Not yet. They see you now." The writing seemed to pulse, as if alive, and a single phrase burned itself into her mind as she stared. The music never stops. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It shouldn't have worked. There was no reception in the basement. Trembling, she pulled it out and saw a new notification. A voicemail from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then came a faint strumming, a slow, melancholic riff that felt agonizingly familiar. "Kurt," she whispered aloud, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. The strumming stopped abruptly, replaced by breathing. Deep, ragged, and uneven. "Don't let them in," a voice rasped, barely audible. The message ended, and the phone died in her hands. As the journalist backed toward the stairs, her flashlight caught something that hadn't been there moments ago. A door, warped and splintered, set into the far wall. It looked impossibly old, its hinges rusted and hanging crookedly. The basement had been inspected thoroughly during renovations. There was no record of any additional rooms. Yet here it was, looming and silent, as if waiting for her. Compelled by a mix of terror and curiosity, she approached the door, her steps slow and deliberate. The closer she got, the stronger the smell became, a mix of damp earth, decayed wood, and something faintly metallic. Her hand hovered over the knob, shaking. Then, before she could turn it, a sudden knock came from the other side. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. The sound reverberated through the basement, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. Then the voice returned, louder this time, as if coming from all around her. "You've heard enough. Now leave." But the door creaked open, just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And in that darkness, something moved. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The door's creak felt deafening in the silence. It opened wider on its own, revealing a void so black it seemed to absorb the faint light of her flashlight. The air that wafted out was freezing, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and something far worse, a metallic tang that reminded her of rusted iron. The journalist's instincts screamed for her to leave, to climb the stairs and never look back. But something in that darkness called to her, a pull she couldn't explain. She took a step closer, her flashlight shaking as she tried to pierce the void. That's when she saw them. Handprints, dozens of them, imprinted faintly on the inside of the door, as if people had been pressing against it from the other side. The prints were smeared, claw-like, as though whoever left them had been trying desperately to escape. A faint hum began to rise from beyond the door, low and dissonant, like an amplifier struggling to hold a single distorted note. It grew louder, almost deafening, and then cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, a voice whispered, chilling and clear, "They never wanted me to leave. Now they won't let you." Panicking, the journalist turned and bolted for the stairs. But as she climbed, her foot landed on empty air. One of the steps was gone, replaced by an abyss that hadn't been there before. She fell forward, catching herself just in time, her fingers gripping the edges of the remaining steps. From below, the darkness seemed to swell, creeping up the walls like ink spreading through water. The hum returned, but now it was layered with voices, fragments of words, distant cries, and a sound that resembled sobbing. The journalist scrambled to her feet, jumping the gap in the stairs and rushing toward the light spilling in from the basement door above. As she reached it, the door slammed shut in her face. She pounded against it, screaming, but the voices grew louder, drowning her out. Turning back toward the basement, she froze. The door within the basement, the one that had opened to darkness, was now fully ajar. And something was stepping through. It wasn't human, that much was clear. The figure that emerged was tall, its edges shifting and rippling as if it were made of smoke. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and every step it took seemed to extinguish what little light remained. In its hand, it held something unmistakable, a guitar. The figure raised its head, and though its face was obscured, the journalist felt its gaze pierce through her. The faint hum shifted into a melody, haunting and melancholic. It was "Come As You Are," but warped, the notes dragging like they were being played underwater. As the music filled the room, the voices from the shadows grew louder, screaming over each other in desperation. "Stop it! Don't listen! You can still leave!" But she couldn't move. The melody was overwhelming, consuming, filling her mind with flashes of images she didn't recognize. A stage bathed in harsh light, a crowd screaming, a hand scrawling lyrics on a notepad. And then a gunshot. The figure stepped closer, and its voice joined the song, soft and echoing. "The truth is in the silence. Find it or it will find you." The figure stopped abruptly, the music fading into a lingering hum. Pointed to the floor at her feet. Trembling, she looked down and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Another notebook, identical to the one she had found earlier. The cover was smeared with blackened fingerprints, and the pages were damp. She hesitated, but the pull was irresistible. Slowly, she picked it up and flipped it open. The first page was blank. So was the second. But on the third page, in bold, uneven handwriting, were the words, "It started here. It will end here." A sudden banging sound erupted from the basement door behind her, snapping her out of her trance. Someone or something was pounding against it from the other side, screaming her name. The pounding on the basement door intensified, and the voice screaming her name grew louder, more desperate. The journalist's breath came in shallow gasps as she clutched the notebook to her chest. She turned back toward the figure, but it was gone, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the lingering melody in the air. The banging stopped, replaced by silence. She stared at the notebook in her hands, her eyes drawn to the last page. This one wasn't blank. In small, cramped handwriting, it read, "If you leave now, you'll never know the truth. But if you stay, you'll never leave at all." The basement door creaked open above her, spilling light down the staircase. A voice, human this time, called her name. "Are you okay?" We heard screaming. It was the contractor, his voice frantic. Without thinking, she bolted up the stairs, clutching the notebook. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the air shift heavier, colder, as though she were passing through an invisible barrier. The contractor grabbed her arm as she stumbled into the hallway. "What happened down there? You look like you've seen a ghost." She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice gone. She glanced back down the stairs, and the basement door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Back in her apartment that night, the journalist sat at her desk, the notebook open before her. She flipped through the pages again, searching for anything that could make sense of what she'd seen. When she reached the last page, the text had changed. The original message was gone, replaced by new words scrawled in blood-red ink. "The music never stopped. Neither will they." Her phone buzzed, startling her. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she whispered. There was no static this time, just silence. And then, faintly, the same distorted melody began to play, this time unmistakable, "Smells Like Teen Spirit." As the song faded, a voice whispered, low and menacing, "You shouldn't have taken it." The call disconnected, and she stared at the notebook. The writing was gone again, leaving the pages blank. The days that followed were a blur of shadows and whispers. The journalist couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, She heard the faint hum of Cobain's guitar, felt the cold presence of something unseen lingering just out of reach. Her friends began to notice her growing paranoia. She would glance over her shoulder in empty rooms, flinch at the sound of footsteps in hallways. Her apartment seemed to take on a life of its own, lights flickering, doors opening on their own, and that familiar melody playing faintly from her radio, even when it was unplugged. One night, she awoke to find the notebook sitting on her bed. She had locked it away in a drawer, yet here it was, open to a single line. It's not over until the last note plays. Unable to take it anymore, she decided to return the notebook to the house. She hoped that leaving it behind would end whatever had followed her. When she arrived, the property was eerily quiet. The current owner was nowhere to be found, the windows dark and lifeless. The basement door stood ajar, waiting for her. Clutching the notebook, she descended the stairs one last time. The air was colder than before, and the hum of the melody seemed to grow louder with each step. At the bottom, the strange door was gone, replaced by a blank wall. But the notebook in her hand began to tremble, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The final page revealed a single sentence, written in jagged letters. "Play it or they'll never let you leave." She looked down to find the guitar, the same one the shadow had carried, resting against the wall. Her hands moved almost against her will, picking it up, the strings cold beneath her fingers. As she strummed the first chord, the room seemed to dissolve around her. Shadows closed in, voices screaming, and the air was filled with the sound of 1,000 haunting melodies merging into one. The last thing she heard was Cobain's voice, soft and echoing. "You wanted the truth. Now you're part of it." When the contractor returned the next day, the basement was empty. The guitar, the notebook, and the journalist were gone. But late at night, neighbors claim they can still hear faint guitar riffs coming from the house, blending into the wind. And sometimes, if you listen closely, a voice whispers from the darkness. The music never stops. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.